Your ancestors had no doctors, no drugs, and no germ theory, and yet they outlasted every plague the ancient world could throw at them. Most people assume prehistoric life was one long medical disaster. The truth is more complicated and far more interesting. We picture our ancestors as helpless against infection. We imagine them dying young from things we now cure in a weekend. But that picture misses something crucial about how survival actually works. The real story involves biology, behavior, and knowledge. It is so practical, it echoes in our medicine today. So why did early humans not simply vanish under waves of epidemic disease? The answer starts with something almost nobody talks about. The one thing this video is really about is a layered defense system. Ancient humans built it without ever knowing it existed. It had 4 distinct layers, and each one mattered. Start with the disease landscape itself. This is where the first surprise lives. Most people assume ancient life meant constant exposure to lethal epidemics. Smallpox, measles, cholera, bubonic plague. Those are the names that come to mind. But here is the thing. Those diseases could not have existed in the ancient world. Not yet. A fast-moving contagious virus needs a constant supply of new hosts. It burns through a small group in days, then it has nowhere left to go. Hunter-gatherer bands typically had between 20 and 150 people. A highly contagious pathogen hitting a group that size faces a brutal problem. It runs out of victims before it can sustain itself. Everyone either dies or builds immunity, and the pathogen collapses with them. The great epidemic killers of history required something. Ancient people simply did not have it. They required cities. They required dense, settled populations sharing water and waste and animal pens. They required agriculture. Without those conditions, mass epidemic disease simply could not take hold. Hunter-gatherers had accidentally created an environment. It was the worst possible setting for a pandemic. They did not know this. It was a byproduct of how they lived, not a medical strategy. What they did face was different. It included wound infections, parasites, respiratory illness, and gut pathogens. The biological threat was constant, grinding, and invisible. And their first line of defense against it was not a remedy. It was behavior. This is where a concept called behavioral immunity becomes important. The idea is elegant. Stop the pathogen before the body ever has to fight it. And humans evolved a powerful automatic system to do exactly that. You still run this system every single day without knowing it. That involuntary recoil when you smell rotting food, that is behavioral immunity. The disgust you feel seeing a festering wound or contaminated water, same system. These are not learned social responses. They are biological, baked into the nervous system before birth. Studies show that infants display disgust reactions to pathogen risks. This happens before any education about disease. The brain is running threat detection software continuously. It works in the background, without your input. For ancient humans, this system carried enormous practical weight. Avoiding spoiled meat reduced exposure to bacterial toxins. Steering clear of visibly sick individuals slowed transmission within the group. Not lingering near decomposing bodies reduced contact with dangerous pathogens. We even see this reflected in the archaeological record. Intentional burial appears remarkably early in the human story. Neanderthals show evidence of burying their dead long before modern humans appear. The motivations are debated: ritual, grief, spiritual meaning. But the practical consequence was clear. It meant keeping decomposing remains out of the living space. That consequence alone was a meaningful reduction in disease exposure. Movement was another behavioral shield. It mattered for sanitation in ways we rarely appreciate. A group that stays in one place accumulates waste. Accumulated waste contaminates local water and food. Contaminated water causes gastrointestinal illness. Without rehydration, that illness can kill. Mobile bands essentially reset their sanitation situation every time they moved. They had no theory to explain why this helped. It helped anyway. Then there is fire. Controlled use of fire dates back at least 400,000 years. Cooking food kills the bacteria and parasites that make raw meat dangerous. The moment early humans started applying heat to their food consistently, he believes it helped drive human evolution itself. We became physically different animals, partly because we started cooking dinner. That is not a small thing. That is a behavioral shift that rewrote our biology. When behavior failed and pathogens got through, ancient humans had a second defense. And it is one of the most sophisticated systems in the known universe. That is not an exaggeration. The immune system. We hear this phrase so often it loses its weight. so consider what it actually does. It can recognize roughly 1 billion distinct molecular shapes. It distinguishes your own cells from foreign invaders at the molecular level. It deploys specialized units with different tactical roles. Some attack immediately. Some gather information before acting. Some remember specific pathogens for decades after a single encounter. It runs constantly, without any conscious instruction from you. This continues every hour of your life. For ancient humans, this system faced a wider range of threats from birth. There was no safety net beneath it, and that pressure had consequences measured across thousands of generations. Individuals whose immune responses worked well, survived, and had children. Those whose responses failed did not. The result, over vast stretches of time, was striking. Populations became genuinely calibrated to their disease environments. There is a devastating modern illustration of what happens when that calibration. When European colonizers arrived in the Americas, they carried pathogens. The indigenous populations had never encountered them. Smallpox and measles tore through communities with no prior exposure. This happened within about a century and a half. This was not a failure of immune strength. Indigenous immune systems were not weak. They were optimized for a completely different disease world. They had never encountered these specific pathogens, so they had built no defenses against them. That same brutal logic of selection had been operating throughout all of human. The populations that made it to the next generation were different. In a real biological sense, they were the ones who had already survived. Resilience was not just passed down as knowledge. It was encoded in their DNA. Now we reach the layer that surprises most people. Ancient humans did not just endure illness passively. They actively tried to treat it. And the tool they used was plants. This sounds primitive until you understand what plants actually are. Plants have been locked in chemical warfare with bacteria, fungi, and parasites. This has been going on for hundreds of millions of years. In that time, they have evolved an extraordinary arsenal of bioactive compounds. Molecules that kill microbes. Molecules that reduce inflammation, manage pain, and alter cellular function. Many pharmaceuticals we use today are derived directly from plants. Others are built to copy plant compounds. Aspirin traces back to salicylic acid found in willow bark. Morphine and codeine come from the opium poppy. Quinine, which treats malaria, comes from cinchona tree bark. Ancient humans discovered these effects through observation and experimentation. There was also a great deal of trial and error. Some of that error was almost certainly fatal. But the knowledge that survived was real. The evidence goes back further than most people imagine. Dental calculus is the hardened plaque that forms on teeth. Scientists can extract and identify plant compounds from ancient calculus. The context does not fit simple diet. One case from El Sidrón cave in Spain is particularly striking. A Neanderthal individual showed signs of a severe dental abscess. That is an intensely painful condition. Analysis of their dental calculus found yarrow, groundsel, and poplar. All of these plants have analgesic or anti-inflammatory properties. The researchers proposed this individual may have been self-medicating. Let that settle for a moment. A Neanderthal, 50,000 years ago, possibly treating their own pain with. That is not superstition. That is pharmaceutical reasoning without the laboratory. By the time written records appear, plant-based medicine is already sophisticated. The Ebers Papyrus is an Egyptian medical text from around 1550 BCE. It lists over 800 formulas using hundreds of plant substances. Modern pharmacologists have analyzed many of these formulas. They found genuinely active compounds with real therapeutic effects. These systems span every continent and thousands of years. The method was not the clinical trial, but the core logic is recognizable. Observe, apply, record what works, and pass it forward. That is science at its foundation. It remains their primary source of care. Researchers today actively follow leads from traditional systems when hunting for. Ancient pharmacology was slow and empirical. It was not primitive. There is one more layer to consider. Modern medicine is only now beginning to quantify it properly. Social connection is medicine, not as a metaphor. Literally, the research is striking. Social isolation raises mortality risk by a striking amount. It is roughly the same as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Loneliness elevates cortisol and impairs immune function. It also worsens outcomes across virtually every disease category. Strong social bonds measurably improve immune response. They also reduce pain perception and accelerate healing. Ancient humans lived in tight groups because survival required it. But the side effect of that tight structure was significant. Sick individuals were almost never left alone. Someone brought food. Someone maintained warmth. Someone ensured the sick person kept drinking water. In a world without intravenous fluids, that last point is not minor. Someone simply needed to make sure you stayed hydrated. Healing rituals performed by shamans in the presence of the whole community did. They created expectation, narrative, and the belief that something was actively. We now call this the placebo effect. We tend to say that word with a slight note of dismissal. But placebo effects produce real, measurable physiological changes. Real reductions in pain. Real drops in stress hormones. Real impacts on immune function. The brain, told that healing is occurring, actually supports healing. A ritual surrounded by community care was not theater. It was activating the most powerful endogenous medicine the body produces. So how did it all eventually break? Because it did break, about 10 to 12,000 years ago. Agriculture arrived. And for all the civilization, it made possible its immediate effect on individual. Skeletons from the transition period tell a clear story. Average height dropped sharply, a reliable signal of nutritional stress. Dental cavities multiplied because grain-heavy diets are rich in fermentable sugars. Evidence of anemia and vitamin deficiencies increased in the bone record. And infectious disease? The epidemics began. Settled populations stopped moving. This ended the sanitation reset that mobility had provided. Density increased. Domesticated animals moved into close quarters with their owners. Cattle contributed the viruses that became measles and smallpox. Pigs and birds fed into influenza strains. Stored grain attracted rodents. Irrigation created standing water, which created mosquito habitat. Trade routes carried pathogens between populations that had never been exposed to. Every disease that we now associate with the great plagues of history is, almost, not a disease of nature. We built the conditions for mass epidemic disease by changing how we lived. Hunter-gatherers had accidentally minimized epidemic risk through their lifestyle. Agriculture traded that protection for caloric surplus and population growth, and paid for it across millennia of epidemic suffering. That is one of the great and underappreciated ironies of human progress. But how did ancient humans survive disease long enough for any of this story to? The honest answer is that they built something without knowing they were building. Behavioral instincts kept pathogens out of the body when possible. Mobility and fire reduced the burden of foodborne and waterborne illness. Immune systems forged under genuine adversity were finely tuned to the threats. Plant knowledge accumulated across generations into a practical pharmacology with. Social structures ensured that sick individuals were cared for rather than. None of these were designed. None required germ theory or a microscope. They were adaptive responses shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of pressure. The ones that worked were passed down. The ones that failed ended with the people who tried them. Ancient life was genuinely hard. Pain had no reliable relief. Childbirth was dangerous. Childhood mortality was high. This is why average lifespans look so short in the data. Adults who made it through early childhood often lived into what we would consider. Modern medicine is extraordinary, and I mean that without reservation. Antibiotics, vaccines, surgery, sanitation. These are genuine revolutions in. But looking at how ancient humans dealt with disease reveals something humbling. They were not passive victims of biology. They were active, adaptive, remarkably resourceful survivors. And the insight the whole story delivers is this. The humans who eventually developed germ theory, built hospitals, and invented. They were built by it. Every generation that survived disease passed forward its knowledge and its biology. Each one was laying one more brick. Tens of thousands of years of people doing the best they could with what they had. And most of the time, it was enough.